Hey, thanks for checking out The Solid Verbal. Now would be a great time to subscribe to the channel for college football content all off season long.
Welcome back to The Solid Verbal, boys and girls. My name is Ty Hildebrand. That fine gentleman is always over there. Always the incomparable Dan Rubenstein, sir. How are you today?
I'm great, Ty. I am excited to talk about excellence. If we are going to do a show today and another one this week on the topic of teams pushing into and through that 10-win barrier, Ty, I think we need to agree at the top that we need to set a standard, right? We can't let teams off the hook. We can't say, well, sometimes. No. Getting to 10 wins, holding to that standard of excellence, Ty. And I, for one, I want to lean into the theme of excellence, Ty, because I think we are going to organize this episode in a world where we're dealing with a quest to win 10 games. We're dealing with...
It is a quest. It's very much a quest.
It's very much a quest. It's very much acquiring the players, the game plans, the coaches, the rosters overall to succeed, to win, to defeat. And I know that this is in the news, Ty, right? Is it not?
Little Tears of the Kingdom action, Dan.
Now, this is a you call because you're a gamer in a way that I am not. I know you have all of our housekeeping information, but I just want to get to this at the top because there is a new Legend of Zelda game. Yes?
Correct. Legends of Zelda, Tears of the Kingdom. Correct.
So I just wanted to ask you if you see this episode and this, duo of episodes going in the vein of the original, the Shigeru Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka vision,
right,
or the current Hidemaru Fujibayashi and Eiji Onuma vision. So I don't know, but I'm going to lean on you for that.
Well, I think we're talking more of an open world now in the world of college football.
That's true.
Are we not?
That is true. Absolutely.
I mean, the horizon, the aperture, if you will, has broadened since the original Zelda, as has been the case in college football.
Yeah, so
there are a lot more things to consider. So we'll talk about that. We've got, I think, a great show coming today. We are not only going to talk about Pitt. Who are you going to talk about? In
Oklahoma
more detail?
State, the Pokes.
Oklahoma State. And then we've got a guest on, David Woods, from the Podcast of Champions.
Yeah, and Bruin Report Online with 24/7.
And Bruin Report Online.
Yeah.
David Woods is going to stop by and give us the lowdown on UCLA.
Correct. Absolutely. A fascinating team. I mean, it's really three fascinating teams who we've seen ceilings that have been quite impressive, whether it's, led by offense, defense, coaching, whatever, recruiting, or just falling off a cliff, right? That it's so precarious for some programs where they're like 9-3, 9-3, 4-8. What now? So no, those are three extraordinarily, I say, fascinating teams.
We will get into that and much, much more. Don't forget to hit subscribe or follow on your podcasting app of choice. If you are ever so inclined, leave us a rating or a review. That stuff helps other people find the show. When they see it, they think, maybe that's a good show. Maybe we'd like to listen to. We would appreciate that. So wherever it is that you listen, if you want to take a little bit of extra time and do that for us, we'd appreciate it. Do us a solid. We will continue doing the Solid Verbal.
Yes.
Verballers.com, of course, is our Patreon. That's where you can go to further support the show. We have some great suggestions that we got from our board of trustees last week, Dan. We had our annual board meeting. It's off limits to the general public. The only way you can get a seat on that board is by winning a spot via our games, again, at verballers.com. We got a great suggestion for a game that we are going to implement. I think we're going to try to implement. I guess we haven't rubber stamped this yet, but before the season starts. So a preseason game that will bleed out into the season and really just get everybody engaged the whole way through. So I'm excited about that. We've got our baseball off-topic show coming up. We've finally been able to dot the I's and cross the T's on that one. So that is coming up very shortly. Before we go any further, Dan, let's get to some news, okay? There's not a lot going on. It is mid-May.
Yes.
We say this every mid-May. There is not a lot going on, but there are a few things that we should mention.
Some straggling transfers, perhaps? I mean, we've got
the transfer thing is still kind of going.
Yeah. Oregon just picked up a receiver from USC, yeah.
That's not to say that there are superstars out there in the transfer portal. However, if you are a team like some of the teams I believe we're going to discuss today, adding the services of those players could help your team.
Definitely.
Could add depth, could take you to another level in a position group. So it's important to track. We'll do what we can to track that moving forward. Hopefully in a few weeks' time, we'll have a bow in this whole thing and we can kind of go through them in kind. But just be advised that transfers are still sort of sorting themselves out.
Yep.
Otherwise, there was some pretty big news in the sports apparel world.
Oh,
I don't know if
yeah.
you saw this. Notre Dame, effectively a free agent. So back in 2014, Notre Dame switched from Adidas, who was their outfitter at the time, to Under Armour. It was part of a big deal. That deal has since expired, or I should say at least the exclusive negotiating window has expired, which means in effect that the Irish are a free agent. Our good friend Matt Brown of the Extra Points newsletter wrote about 1,800 words on it that he sent out today.
Great.
Matt always makes us smarter when he writes about these business-related issues in college football. I will link that in the description. Go and check it out. It's notable, if only because Notre Dame's a mega brand.
Mm-hmm.
Love them or hate them, they're a mega brand, especially in the world of college athletics. The fact that they're out there on the open market looking for a new outfitter, it won't affect me. It won't affect you. Hopefully, it will have some effect on the uniforms, i.e. no more green jerseys. That's just me speaking personally. But it is interesting to watch these kinds of things unfold. Again, I'll link it. You can check out Matt's more informed viewpoint on the matter, but it is something I expect you'll be hearing more about over the coming days and weeks. So take note of that.
Yep.
Don't know if you have any burning thoughts on that,
Well,
Dan.
I saw our friend Andy Staples write about it as sort of an interesting perspective in that it could be an opportunity for Notre Dame to partner with somebody to exclusively produce uniforms, but not necessarily keep athletes tied to whatever brand that is. So if it's more of a He used the example of Lululemon, right, which has exploded in like the athleisure space. That's the douchiest way I could come up with labeling that term. But, that they don't make shoes, right? So that Notre Dame athletes could just go out and seek their own individual shoe deals in the way that, professional basketball players do. And so a more a la carte approach, which especially because I think Under Armour is like fully out of or trying to get out of college sponsorship. So as we saw what happened with them pulling out of the UCLA deal a couple of years ago, that now it's sort of a Nike Adidas game, college sports. And so, maybe we'll see schools, and Notre Dame would be a huge example of this, like partnering with somebody who is not necessarily, making shoes, and leave that up to individual schools or individual players of schools or individual sports. Like it's one of those things. I went to an indoor, like a tennis tournament, a college NCAA tennis tournament, ITA. Tennis, ITF, maybe? That's who does college tennis. And the Under Armour schools all wear ASICS shoes because Under Armour doesn't even make tennis shoes. So to approach that from a more, I guess, a la carte perspective, it's interesting. It's a new world.
It is a new world, and I think it's going to continue being a new world because we can all see where this is headed.
Mm-hmm.
It won't be long before athletes have some cut of the apparel game. Some cut in that merchandise, eventually it's going to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're Notre Dame, if you're looking to try and differentiate your brand, your program from others, giving you, I don't know, that ability to express yourself. It's kind of like an NBA model in a sense, right? Just giving your players a chance to express their individualism through footwear or through whatever.
Right.
It's an interesting model that nobody else is doing. And in this world where it's a attention economy, it helps.
Ooh, you trying to one up my premium athleisure?
I tried to go a little extra douchey with that one, but it's true.
Yeah, it's true. It's different with football, and it's different with different positions within sports, right? That like running backs and quarterbacks potentially, and receivers, maybe safeties will sell shoes, but like defensive tackles and offensive, the guard playing on the left side
Big
may not.
Joe Alt wears ASICs.
Yeah,
right?
they might not be selling shoes and have that same sort of following because they're just glamour positions and non-glamour positions. That's the reality. But no, Notre Dame will be fascinating, especially with fewer bidders. I think you're going to see prices being driven down, which is interesting. Because Under Armour came in with big premium offers, and now they're like, well, obviously the return on investment was not what they expected. So no, it's an interesting space for sure.
Elsewhere in college football news, again, it's mid-May, so be advised. There is a lot still churning with respect to Pac-12 media rights. And our friend Ross Dellinger, who's been on this show countless times, wrote an article dropped earlier today. We're recording this on Monday, titled "The Next Wave is Coming, Expansion, Realignment at What's at Stake for the Power 5 Conferences." Ross did an excellent job, I think, just defining the landscape and not doing so with any kind of agenda, not really parroting any narratives that you may have heard. He just did it pretty black and white, telling you what's at stake, what he's hearing, and how this thing could go over the next 3 months, over the next 4 to 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And what it amounts to is this, Dan. I don't want to be overly simplistic here. What it amounts to is the Big Ten and the SEC, until something moves them to do otherwise, seem pretty content where they're at. But you've got strife in the ACC, particularly with schools like Florida State and Clemson, and apparently 5 other schools that have banded together, have met on the sly, trying to figure out if there is some way, some wiggle room within this monstrous grant of rights deal that they signed with ESPN that extends for 13 more seasons and stands to put them about $30 million behind on an annual basis, schools in both the Big Ten and the SEC. One of the things that they may push for in the coming days, as the ACC kind of has its own spring meetings, is some unequal sharing of revenue. Now, if you're Florida State, that makes a lot of sense. If you're not Florida State, it doesn't.
Right.
So the direction that conversation ultimately heads remains to be seen. Feels like a bit of a long shot to me, but that seems like they'd be coloring within the lines to try and make it work for them without trying to nuke the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not they can escape that grant of rights deal, it seems pretty bulletproof from what most legal scholars have advised. Certainly you and I are not that. We are going on the word of others, but from the sounds of it, it's going to be very tough to wriggle out of that one. There's like just no breathing room for them to get out of it unless they just leave en masse and they start their own thing. While that conversation is going on the ACC side, trying to figure out how they can bridge that gap from a money standpoint, you got the whole thing going on out west, which we've talked about, I feel like ad nauseum on the show. We had Brett McMurphy on like 2 months ago to talk about it. It's being written about every week by somebody in college football media. We've recently had competing reports that were filed. The Big 12 is going to gobble up the Pac-12. Oh no, the Pac-12 is in a good spot. You constantly have this warring of sources and reporting in some sense of the word. What it boils down to is over the next month, over the next 2 months, there will be a conclusion with respect to this Pac-12 media rights discussion. We will find out what the deal looks like. We will find out what it means for the short, medium, and long term in college football. Most people that you read seem relatively convinced that the Pac-12 can cobble together some sort of media deal that will keep the league together on a short-term basis. By that, I mean 4 to 6 years. Not a long-term 25-year thing, but just something to sort of tide them over until the next wave of expansion a few years down the line.
Right.
That seems to be the more measured consensus. I shudder a little bit when I read some of the very Big 12 heavy reporting that seems to indicate, we know who we're talking about here, but it seems to indicate that this meteor has already hit, that the Pac-12 is already making contingency plans, and that it's a matter of time. It's going to happen in the next few months that they're all going to disband. To be clear, that could happen, but it just seems like if it were so bad as some of the reporting has claimed, that would have happened already.
Sure.
And it hasn't. So this is all a very long way of saying that the Pac-12, regardless of the media rights that they're able to negotiate and sign probably within the next 60 days, they're still on very thin ice over the long term. In the short and medium term, it remains to be seen. We know for sure that the Big 12 is ready to gobble everybody up, especially the Arizona schools, Colorado and Utah.
Right.
They're willing to take pretty much everybody. And then beyond that, if you're the Big 10, if you're the SEC, you are in a very advantageous position where you don't need to add anybody. You don't need to do anything. You can sit and wait. And if an opportunity presents itself, if Oregon and Washington fall off the back of a truck, then maybe. If Notre Dame falls off the back of a truck, why not? Even Florida State could be an interesting play for the SEC or for the Big Ten. Who knows?
But the ACC has right of first refusal, right, with Notre Dame?
I don't even know anymore what the deal is, right? All this stuff seems like it's subject to legal interpretation.
Right.
This is all a very long way of saying that it is going to be a very active couple years in college football around the expansion subject. It doesn't mean it will happen, but it does seem as if there is a lot pointed in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, every one of these stories is sort of like, well, here's what could happen or might happen or could happen in the next 6 months, 1 month, 10 years, whatever. I think the reporting that the certain heavyweight teams in the ACC are unhappy with their situation financially and in the way that the ACC is positioned as the SEC and Big Ten grow and the Big 12 has been aggressive and the Pac-12 is up there. I think that's correct. I think that's certainly
news.
True. Yeah.
By the way, that is news because we had heard for a while now that both Florida State and Clemson, it wasn't all that long. It was like 2 months ago
right.
that at a public meeting among the powers that be at Florida State,
so it was like a presentation. Yeah,
it was a presentation where he fired a very public warning shot that something needs to change or else.
Yeah,
I'm paraphrasing, but that was basically what he was saying. And nobody knows what or else means because, again, there's contracts and potentially $120 million penalty. Mm-hmm. So many factors that go into this, but I think it's news, as Ross pointed out, that it's not just Florida State and Clemson.
Yeah.
That it might be 5 other teams. The race will be on now to figure out who are those teams and who else might be part of this conversation. But ultimately, you're talking about half the league.
Yeah, it's all fascinating and depressing all at the same time, right? It's, this intense FOMO that's spreading throughout the ACC that like, oh, we're going to make a bunch less money. Oh, we're not going to be the SEC or Big Ten. Oh, we're locked into this. And like, we are not going to be in a super league. The top of the ACC feels, Florida State or Clemson or whoever feels like they should be in every single premier conversation, which is their right. That's fine. That's their perspective. And then you have the Big 12 and Pac-12. And I don't think any Pac-12 team actively wants to go to the Big 12, right? They might be left with no choice if they're crazy disappointed with whatever the new Pac-12 TV deal is, but I don't think Colorado wants to go to the Big 12. I don't think the Arizona schools, I don't think Utah. I think they're happy being on the West Coast, being associated, and for a long time USC and UCLA, but they're happy being associated with the other schools on the West Coast. It makes sense given the history of college sports to be associated with geographic rivals. And so the Big 12 is aggressive, as they should be. They should be looking out for their own long-term survival. And if a West Coast footprint helps to ensure that, great. I'm just not sold on the actual product of the Big 12 in comparison to what the Big 10, SEC, ACC, and even like a 10-team Pac-10 has to offer in terms of the top of the leagues in the athletic history. Like, you're asking me to say, like, oh, well, the Big 12, once they add like the Arizona schools, now it's going to be a premier conference, or Arizona and Colorado. Like, I don't know. It just feels like an agreement among like the 6th best teams in multiple conferences to survive.
You have compared some of what the Big 12 is doing to the old Taco Bell Cantina concept.
Yeah, just like trying to make a nicer version of something that, look, I like Taco Bell. This is no slam against Taco Bell.
Not a sponsor.
But like all the Brett Yormark stuff, like we're going to play at Rucker Park. We're going to play in Mexico. We're going to have more on-field interviews. The name of the game with the Big 12 is innovation. I've heard that before with Larry Scott. Heard that before. You know what the name of the game is? Producing as many excellent teams to play in January as humanly possible to win 10 or 11 games as Power 5 teams. Everything else is just buzzword nonsense, which is why like, oh, Taco Bell has margaritas now at this special occasion. Okay, cool. Still Taco Bell. So I'm just sort of, I look at how, whether it's the ACC, whether it's Oregon and Washington wanting to go to the Big Ten, I'm looking at all of like these schools with their FOMO, their financial FOMO and attention FOMO, as like, we need to have a spot in these major mega super conferences. And it's clearly at the expense of the health of the sport overall nationally, but everybody's looking out for themselves, which on a certain level you understand, and on a certain level you're like, well, that sucks, and it's going to lead to a sport that's nowhere near as fun. And if you were to ask the average college football fan, in my opinion, it's at the expense of the sport. People like the expanse of the sport. They like that the West Coast has this and that the Southwest has this and that, the Northeast, even though it's not a college football hotbed, you get like a weird Syracuse game or a weird Penn State or weird Boston College or Pitt, and like they're involved in the ACC randomly, and we had a Big East and we have all these teams in the Southeast. Like, it's cool that you have this varying stylistic and cultural expanse within the sport. And now everybody just wants to be a Big Ten or SEC team. And they think that, what happened in the Premier League and in Europe, where it's like Super League, and everybody's like, no, that sounds awful. That sounds truly terrible and against everything we love about this sport. And every single college football program is dying to be involved in some sort of mega super conference. And it's, it's a little bit depressing, Ty.
We'll see. More to come on this again. If you would have believed some of the reporting, the beginning of May was a deadline, but that's been punted out.
Sure.
I think, to be honest, we will finally get some conclusion on this before the end of June.
I hope so.
I think before the end of June is when we'll actually get some clarity on what things look like. And if anybody's going to move, we'll find out then.
Yeah.
But stay tuned.
Yeah. And if Oregon's going to go to the Big Ten in 2028, it will make me sad. It will make me actively bummed out that Oregon is a Big Ten team playing against Maryland and Purdue and Ohio State and Michigan State. Like, it just, I don't know. There's just like an
still play USC and UCLA
Great.
and Washington,
Cool.
maybe.
That's fine, but it's just stupid.
All right. That's all we have in terms of news.
Yeah.
Make sure you follow along on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram.
Yeah.
All the hot spots we'll post wherever we can. If we see anything of note, Dan, give me that Quest music.
See, this is what I care about, Ty. Football, games, humans. That's it.
Solid Wife Kate has been into Tears of the Kingdom.
Oh, good.
She is into Tears of the Kingdom. She was into Breath of the Wild.
Not a sponsor, could be.
Not a sponsor, could be. So we are talking the quest to 10 wins. If you go back and listen to the episode we did a week ago, I don't know, that was the next step-by-step themed series of episodes that we did. We talked about 6 teams. What's going to take to get to 8 wins comfortably? Today it's 10. We're talking Pitt. We're talking Oklahoma State. We're going to have a guest on here in a little bit. We're going to talk through UCLA. Shall I start with Pitt? Do you want to start with Oklahoma State? Should we flip a coin? What works best for you?
Can you find connective tissue between Pitt and Oklahoma State? I think they played maybe a few years ago, like Mason Rudolph era. So I guess that's the connective tissue. You can go first. You're wearing Pitt blue as the Pitt diehard you are.
Mason Rudolph went to the Pittsburgh Steelers.
Oh, there's connective tissue too. But I know they played.
Yeah.
I know they had an out-of-conference matchup, at least one.
Well, look, I mean, Pitt, I'm glad I had a chance to study Pitt.
Okay.
And I'm glad I had a chance to study all the teams that I've studied so far, but Pitt in particular, because I learned a few things I didn't know. First off, do you want to take a guess? How long Pat Narduzzi has been at Pitt?
8 years, 7 years, something like that. A crazy long time now, right?
He's been there since 2015.
Yeah.
Does it feel like he's been there that long?
Kind of, yeah. Kind of at this point. Well, just because I remember he was the Pitt coach when they upset Clemson all those years ago, right? The James Conner Pitt coach. So I know it's been a hefty amount of time. But man, yeah, he is not a new coach at Pitt.
Unbelievable. Been there since 2015 was his first season.
Yeah.
We're now in the year of Lord 2023, and we're talking about what's it going to take to get to 10 wins comfortably. It has been a good run for Pat Narduzzi. He's been there 8 seasons. He had 3 8-win campaigns, 1 9-win campaign, 1 11-win campaign, and 21 with Kenny Pickett. Obviously, that's factoring in bowl games, but solid, right?
Definitely.
Solid. The only reason we're talking about them in a 10-win framework is they've been pretty solid. So the other interesting data point that you can find if you use the tool that they have out on 24/7 Sports, the Team Talent Composite tool.
Yeah.
During the Pat Narduzzi era, Pitt has exclusively been 6th, 7th, and 8th most talented in the ACC. They'd never been higher. They'd never been lower. So stable,
Yeah.
but not cracking into that top 5. And so what I think this all means for Pat Narduzzi, first off, he is a really good coach. He's got the Pitt program to a point of stability, but also a salty point, right? Stable in that the floor is never lower than like 5 wins. You're not going to have a catastrophic Pitt season. At least we haven't seen it. I suppose anything's possible. We haven't seen it yet. Salty in that the transfer portal has made life for teams like Pitt very difficult. And I go back to like the Jordan Addison stuff when he left for USC. We celebrated Salty Pat Narduzzi last season, right? He had some things to get off his chest last season in the wake of that transfer. My conclusion on the Pitt side is that to get to 10 wins, it is a question of offense and by extension recruiting, both out of high school and through the portal. Again, 8 seasons for, can I just call him Nard Dog? Can I call him the new Nard Dog?
It's your segment, Ty. Go for it.
8 seasons for the new Nard Dog. He has had a top 50 offense 4 times. Okay. Each time they finished with 8 wins. It seems like he's got the ground game mostly figured out. That's usually pretty solid. The passing game, though, that's where they've been very inconsistent. And weirdly, if you look at the quarterbacks that Nard Dog has had, Nate Peterman,
NFL
Ben
quarterbacks,
DiNucci,
yeah.
Kenny Pickett. That's 3 NFL quarterbacks. I'm not saying they've been great NFL quarterbacks, but obviously somebody in the league thinks they're good enough to play. They've all started.
Throwing to like good to excellent receivers over that time.
Yeah. Nate Peterman's kind of a meme. Okay, I get that.
But not in college.
Not in college. He was decent.
Yeah.
He was decent in college. So weirdly, the passing game's been very inconsistent despite the fact that he's had some like NFL caliber quarterbacks, we have to say it, come through that program. I don't know what it's going to take to get that side of things figured out. I know his pedigree is as a defensive coordinator. He's been very good at piecing together like 3-star defenders, getting together a top 25 defense year in and year out. That just has not been the case on offense. And I don't know what's going to take. I don't know if it's Frank Signetti, the offensive coordinator, or again, right? Or if it's somebody new and innovative, or what it takes. But it seems like that side of the football has very much eluded him. I also have to mention the recruiting thing a little bit. Pitt's in the middle of the pack most years in the ACC. They're in the bottom half of Power 5 teams, and geographically, they're in a good spot for talent.
Yeah.
That Western PA, Ohio corridor is pretty good, but they tend to get crowded out by the bigger programs to the east, to the west. A lot of the local talent has actually started going south. And in the meantime, Pitt has tried to recruit a little bit more nationally. You can see it with where their high school talent comes from. They've gotten a few of the locals, but they've branched out into Florida, into Texas, Georgia, California, Virginia, et cetera, et cetera. There's a school of thought out there that they'd be better focusing more locally. However, the flip side of that is some of the locals who go south or go elsewhere, after they figure out that they're not going to play there, then they come back home.
Right.
So, and that's been the case with like a little bit with Phil Jerkovic. I mean, Phil Jerkovic would have played at Boston College, but he decides to follow Frank Signetti back to Pitt. We have Derek Davis coming back home, was at LSU. See what he can do at the running back position. Where things stand for Pitt, I think across the board, is they probably need to figure out a way to recruit better on the offensive side of the ball, to piece together that talent on the offensive side of the ball and keep more of those guys at home instead of going south, going to Penn State, going to Ohio State, wherever. I don't know if they can do that. I have not seen a noticeable uptick on any of the recruiting things. Like everywhere I check,
right,
it kind of seems stable, almost too stable. And so I'm curious to see what it's going to take to break them out of this cycle that they're in. What I'm curious of, perhaps most curious of, is the quarterback position this year and the ones that follow, because Phil Jerkovic is most likely going to be the guy, again, the transfer from Boston College via Notre Dame. He is a Western PA kid. They also brought over Christian Veilleux, who was pretty low on the depth chart given Drew Aller and some of the other folks on the Penn State side of things. He transferred over as well. He figures to be the backup, but he's got some eligibility left, and he could probably play next year and I think another year after that. So if they can establish some sort of rhythm at quarterback where they can build around a guy who's not going to transfer again, if they can bring in some receiver talent, because they've got the running game pretty well figured out, they just need a little bit of a lift in that offensive side of the ball. They've got a schedule that I think makes it doable. But the question, again, is the same as every year. It's like, if they're not going to play offense, if they're not going to get inside that top 50 level, which I don't know because there is a lot new, 10 wins is probably going to elude them once more.
Yeah, and I think in the short to medium term, look, it's quarterback and defense, and Pitt has largely figured out defense. They've had star power on all three levels during Pat Narduzzi's time on defense. Right. They've found star power at running back, receiver, along the offensive line. They've gotten guys drafted, and you're right. It comes down to quarterback, and it's losing the dum-dum game generally in the first 4 to 5 weeks of the season. Last year it was Georgia Tech. The year before that it was Western Michigan. And look, 2021 was a charmed year where Kenny Pickett fully realized his potential and stays healthy. And, his connection with, I think it's Jared Wayne and Jordan Addison was exemplary. And so they're another team that's just a development cycle team and just need to be a little bit crisper every week against teams in an unstable ACC. You're right. They're the mark of stability. And so it's just, don't lose the dum-dum game. Don't lose that. Look, losing at Louisville, losing at North Carolina last year, whatever. Those are tough road spots, even with, down defenses or whatever. But it's the dum-dum game. That to me is the separation point with Pitt. Because I think you're right. The geography is there. The recruiting, they should be active in the portal for guys maybe coming back home to the Northeast or whatever we're calling,
and
Western
they've done a good
PA.
job there, Dan. They have done a reasonable job on that front, and it feels like the guys that they brought, and the Keaton Slovis a year ago, that didn't quite work out.
Good. Yeah.
Right. But it was, I thought, a noble attempt. Now this year, 2 guys, Phil Jerkovic, Christian Veyu. It's not a bad strategy.
No.
And it's not a bad program to step into. They've got some recent success with Kenny Pickett that they can use to recruit. It's just not over the full tenure of Pat Narduzzi. We've just seen a few flashes recently that they can use to their advantage. I don't know.
I mean, look, rich football history. And the other thing is they're like, I guess it's them and NC State where they're just like the gift and curse of having a high floor every year, where it's just like,
that's it, man.
You've set expectations to a really interesting place, but you also know that like other shoe's going to drop one of these weeks. Where you're just like, what the hell was that? And so that to me is a depth thing. That to me is an aggression on offense things, because you see this from a lot of defensive head coaches where they run offenses to serve the defense because they don't necessarily have confidence in the depth on defense. So let's keep them rested on the sideline. So those are the next steps to me, is a little more aggression on offense, more chances, and just, more of a vision there.
Give me the Quest sound. I need to hear it. All right, kill it.
Okay. So what is that? You've got swords, hearts, and rings. Rings is probably defense. The heart is probably life force. That's depth, and the swords are offense. Okay. So we need a little bit more in the way of sword sharpening for Pitt.
The hell's going on with Oklahoma State?
I don't know. That's the full review of Oklahoma State. Look, Oklahoma State, when they are threatening or getting to 10 wins over the past decade, the mid-teens, the early to mid-20 teens, whatever we're calling that, were great, right? In terms of quarterback, receiver, running back, offensive skill. They developed offensive linemen. There was some star power on defense, but they didn't really come into their own until they got to Jim Knowles.
My guy.
Your guy, Jim Knowles. And so it's always been an Oklahoma State team that if they're going to win a bunch of games, they're going to sneaky recruit decently well, find a 4-star receiver or 4 every so often and find a 4-star linebacker and develop them. And for whatever reason, Oklahoma State had been a stable program under Mike Gundy forever and ever and ever. He's been there. He's, the longest tenured guy, I assume, in the Big 12. And so at this point, you're looking at an Oklahoma State program that is now on to its 3rd defensive coordinator in 3 years. Jim Knowles, Derek Mason. Now they went to the lower level to hire their new guy who's going to run a 3-3-5, which is great. They're extraordinarily active in the portal, both in and out. But, they bring in a great receiver from Washington State, but they lose, whoever to another big program. And so they got hit in their secondary. They got hit on defense, Mason Cobb over to USC, their best returning linebacker. And so Right now, it's a question of where's the stability, and if it's quarterback and defense, I think the defense will be all right. I think there's a good enough, the linebacking core, they bring in quality guys at linebacker. I think they've got guys on defense, but now it's like, Hope Allen Bowman's awesome out of nowhere, because that's where they are as a program, where they've completely messed up quarterback. And Spencer Sanders is gone, and he was the guy forever and ever. And so it's really tough to outline unless you are just fully out on the new look Big 12 moving forward and the prospects there, that like it's hard to see Oklahoma State going back to that point. They hire their longtime receivers coach as offensive coordinator, Casey Dunn. He's been there in that position as offensive coordinator since 2020. They haven't fielded a top 50 offense since he arrived. And look, there's the caveat that Spencer Sanders gets hurt last year and they finish the season 2-5. They fall off their cliff, destroyed by Kansas State. But when you look at where recruiting is at right now, not great at all. And you look at where quarterback is right now, not promising. They lose one of their best receivers to TCU last year, or this past portal stretch. It's hard to see them looking there's a little bit of like an Iowa State vibe to where they might become. Like the defense will bounce back, but offensively, it's just they've got guys at receiver especially, but like I see stars, but not star performances all the time from Oklahoma State. And they just seem like they're going to be floating in that 7 to 8 win region without that kind of offensive force and just identity right now, because I don't see them building it up on both sides of the ball at the same time, which you generally need to have to be a 10-ish win team. So I'm kind of out on the prospect of Oklahoma State returning to that pretty like crazy consistent point where they were a few years ago.
We got a question maybe last week, one of these recent Brew and A episodes that we did over on Patreon at verballers.com about teams that missed their window.
Yeah.
And I think for the most part, I don't buy into that. I think you're always like a player or two away in college football from reopening the window and getting back to where you were. But Oklahoma State, it feels like Oklahoma State's been trending in the wrong direction for a couple of years now. Now, that said, not too far removed from being like 6 inches or whatever away from the playoff. Okay. They've had good recent teams, but it feels like the overall momentum, the trajectory of the program is going in the wrong direction, especially with some of the transfer stuff we saw this past off season.
Yeah.
Last season they lost 6 of their final 8 games. Of course, there are caveats there, but it definitely ended with a bit of a whimper. I'm looking at the schedule now for this coming season. I mean, the Big 12 is sort of a crapshoot. It feels like it could go any of 1,000 different directions. And with the way that this team is constituted, I really don't know what to make of Oklahoma State. Their over-under is 6.5 per the lines that DraftKings released like a week or two ago now.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if I could give a recommendation on that.
No. They had look,
they're a total wild card to me.
They have all Big 12 caliber defensive players up front. They absolutely do. They have filled out the roster in impressive ways there. But the rest of the roster just isn't there. They have guys who on any given Saturday will look like an All-American at receiver and then go 3 catches for 39 yards the next week. Like there is no junkyard Jim Washington. There's no Tylen Wall. There's no guys like that. There's no like every week this guy is going for blah, but there's no Chuba Hubbard, right? There's a guy who will go 18 carries for 177 the next week, 14 for 59. And there's just that week to week consistent, very good Oklahoma State program. It's hard to see bringing it back out of the magician's hat.
The weird thing about this, and then we'll move to our guest, since I don't think we have too much else to say about Oklahoma State. The weird thing about Oklahoma State is you look at the schedule, and yes, the Big 12 is a crapshoot, and it feels like there are a lot of teams on even footing. But in a normal year, quote unquote normal, if we're talking back to the days of yore when Oklahoma State was playing more consistently at a higher level, at Arizona State, at Iowa State, at West Virginia, at UCF, at Houston, everything else at home, that feels really advantageous.
Yeah.
That feels like that's a really good road home split. And I wish I felt better about it. I just don't know where Oklahoma State's at as a program. It seems like it could go any of 1,000 different directions.
Yeah, the quarterback of the future is named Zane Flores, so I'm rooting for it so I can say his name all the time.
Love a good Zane.
It's just, it's hard to piece together, at least in mid-May. We'll see.
Right, and solveverbal@gmail.com. Let us know what we got right. Let us know what we got wrong. Shall we get to our guest of honor?
Let's do that. Let's talk some Bruins. 8, clap it up. All right, Ty, I'm going to take this introduction right now because, I don't know, I grew up a UCLA fan. I actively want to see UCLA football, the LA schools, do well, even if they have turned their back on West Coast football and have decided to do everything they can to throw this wonderful region of college football into the dumpster. What an introduction for David Woods. What an introduction. David Woods from the Podcast of Champions and Bruin Report Online. How are you today?
I'm good, and it was quite an intro, and I'm right there with you. I think it's a not great move at all for college football, but money plays, man.
Money plays. Okay, so we are talking UCLA as a current 8-ish win program. They won 9 regular season games this past year, and an exciting, explosive offense. And I suppose we can talk about Chip Kelly's defensive history, but we'll stick with the positive here. What is it that has gotten UCLA to this point where they are a good to very good team with what appears to be a ceiling under Chip Kelly?
It's pretty much exactly what you said. The offense, I mean, I'm pretty convinced that between you, me, Ty, and about 8 of our friends, he could craft a pretty good offense, our man Chip. And it's gotten to a point where I think even with Dorian Thompson-Robinson leaving, even with Zach Charbonnet leaving, the system is now in place where you can probably turn out a top 20, top 15 offense pretty much no matter who he runs out there. And it's gotten to that level. The reason it's got a ceiling is because the defense has not been figured out at all. You started with Jerry Azzanaro the first 2 years where it was pretty much just Azzanaro's defense. Then they brought in Brian Norwood from Navy to kind of layer in some 4-2-5. That didn't work. And then they brought in Bill McGovern last year, who brought in some NFL concepts that also didn't work. The defense has been pretty much stuck between 80th to 110th in each of his 5 years. And so, things have not been worked out on that end. Now they're going to try out Danton Lynn, who is a Ravens assistant who's coming in and, whatever you can assess from spring. I mean, it looks like he's got a good head on his shoulders. He's saying the right things, but who knows until you actually watch the thing out there, whether it's going to do what needs to be done, which is get into top 50 territory.
So UCLA in the last decade has fielded good defenses. This is not a place that has been unable to find NFL level talent. I mean, you go back to when Anthony Barr, Eric Kendricks, Miles Jack, like big time players, NFL caliber players anchoring really good top 30, top 15 type defenses. What is it about the Chip Kelly era? I guess from a talent perspective, if it's a recruiting thing, if it's a development thing, if that's what's holding them back, which it's pretty clear it is there any hope on the horizon from a talent perspective that things may change as UCLA heads to a new conference?
There's a little bit. The NIL situation is kind of the game changer in a few different respects. So initially, Chip Kelly's first few years, high school recruiting was, I won't say deprioritized, but it was the situation where they weren't targeting top tier prospects. They weren't targeting the classic guys that, I'm going to be shouting this, like a crazy person, but UCLA can recruit. It can recruit at a top 15 level, and it has done it historically. Chip Kelly didn't approach it that way. He wanted to kind of target his guys. He was looking for, 3 stars with length and, the measurables and all that idea. It didn't work the first couple of years. They brought in a lot of guys who have since essentially transferred out. Then they were early on the learning curve with the transfer portal. They started to attack that really well, but now with NIL, that's getting more competitive. UCLA has some NIL backing. They were able to land Dante Moore, which, let me tell you, had something to do with NIL.
Sure.
But there's going to be a ceiling to that until it's sort of, there's a cart before the horse situation. They need to win at a higher level than 9-3 to really open up the wallets of a lot of UCLA's boosters to support NIL. I think at this stage, I won't say it's capped out. I think there is still room if the defensive scheme can get figured out, because there's talent in the program. It's not, it's not the most talented UCLA team in history, but there is talent in the program. Schedule's pretty weak this year. But they need to put together probably one or two really, really good seasons before they can start getting the support they need to actually attack recruiting the way that needs to happen. But Chip is starting to get a handle on, I actually need to get talent in the program. It can't just be my measurable and, mad scientist ideas.
Right.
So we will see. But they need to win some more on the field.
My question is actually for both of you, Dan, an Oregon alum, and David, obviously a notable guru in all things UCLA football. I'm curious about the parallels between what we saw from Chip at Oregon and now what we're seeing from him at UCLA. Different starting points, right? He stepped in at Oregon. That was instantly a double-digit win team. At UCLA, it's been a slower build. It's taken a while, like 3 years to implement the offense. But are there parallels with how he is building this thing now at UCLA that mirror what he did at Oregon, maybe outside of hiring some of his friends from his previous regime, that can maybe give us some tell as to when it might get to that 10-win level?
My sense of it, and Dan, you can jump in whenever,
Sure.
but my sense of it is at Oregon, Chip inherited a program that was already firing on all cylinders or pretty close to it. I mean, Mike Bellotti did a great job there, and the guy, name's escaping me, the guy before Bellotti did a great job.
Rich Brooks, yeah.
Yeah, Rich Brooks building the program. And Chip Kelly was able then to learn as the offensive coordinator for 2 years. He was able to get familiarity with the recruiting apparatus at Oregon, all of the things that were already in place. None of those program things had to change when Chip Kelly then took over the head coaching job. At UCLA, he was starting at basically the studs because Jim Mora had more or less cratered over the last couple of years at UCLA. It was entirely new support staff, entirely new recruiting apparatus, entirely new coaching staff. He had to make all those decisions for himself. He wasn't inheriting a defensive coordinator. And I think Chip Kelly is a fantastic offensive coordinator. Absolutely a studly offensive coordinator. And I think you could throw him into a triple option and he'd be great. I think you could throw him into a West Coast system that's pure traditional NFL stuff and he'd be great. I think he knows offense backwards and forwards. The rest of the program stuff, I think he's been learning as he's gone, but I think at Oregon, and this is where you can jump in, but I think there was a lot of that stuff was already in place for him to just kind of inherit.
Yeah, the other thing with the Oregon thing is that was his first big shot, right? That's when he has his hunger. That's when they're recruiting nationally because you have to at Oregon. And I think you do have to do at UCLA because UCLA is a big enough brand that I think it resonates with people. And UCLA has had success, recruiting nationally going into Texas. But I think there's also this perception, which I don't think is true with UCLA, where like you can just go into your backyard. You just recruit a Pac-12 champion in Southern California. I don't think you can. I don't think you can find linemen in Southern California like you can when you recruit nationally or even more regionally, right? And you couple that with, I think, Chip Kelly, not really working out in the NFL, taking a year off to broadcast. And I just don't know I don't think it's an energy thing. I think Chip Kelly really wants to win a ton of games. It's just where college football is now, you have to build a recruiting machine. You have to build out a huge staff, which costs money, more money in LA to have, you can't just pay a recruiting staff. You can't pay everybody $50K like you can perhaps in other parts of the country. And so you have to say, if we want to win 10 games a year, we have to recruit aggressively in Texas. We have to recruit aggressively in the Midwest, in Georgia, in Florida, whatever, because UCLA is a big enough brand. You either do or you don't. And I just haven't seen it from UCLA with that type of aggression to build out a deep defensive line, to build out, how do you find the next Tack McKinley? If you ask Chip Kelly, it's maybe somebody will work out at Bowling Green or North Texas or Pennsylvania. Whereas when he's with Oregon, he's going to Hawaii and finding DeForest Buckner and he's finding Eric Armstead in Northern California. From the outside, I don't see the type of aggression needed to fully take advantage of how big of a name UCLA is.
Yeah, and I think that's nail on the head for the most part. I think, and this is where the NIL piece comes in, because I think he was, there was sort of a symbiotic thing going on with Dante Moore. I think he was excited by the idea that they were in the running, and he then got energized by that idea that, we have the money to play with this. Okay, we can work on this. But I think for him to get to the point where he's going to be able to do that with 4 or 5 national recruitments a year, he's got to win more because the pocketbooks have to open. But I think that gave him a little bit of proof of concept for what is possible at UCLA. Right. You can land guys like this, but you have to play the game that everyone else is playing.
Yeah, there is something about like you're either in or you're out, right? That this is the dollar amount that it will take. And we heard stories about this with Urban Meyer and USC, where it's just like, this is my expectation for what a training table looks like. This is
Right.
when a recruit from Missouri visits UCLA and they're also visiting Texas and Georgia and Oregon and Ohio State, and they come to UCLA and it's completely less in every regard. What are we doing? Why are we spending any money on football if we're not going to spend enough money on football?
Well, training table is one area where Chip Kelly has not skimped.
Good, good. Glad to hear.
They've got the filet mignon. There was a whole. I recommend going into it at some point. The LA Times expose on what they were serving at the training table dinners is pretty fantastic.
How much of it is that UCLA and obviously USC as well? They're not in college town. They are competing with places, and I'm not even talking about Georgia or Ohio State or something like that, but they are in an expensive part of the country, and there is not a college culture in the way that there is in Knoxville, in Eugene, Oregon, and Columbus. Does that play a role in limiting what the UCLA fan base is willing to do? If they are more interested in the Lakers, the Dodgers, whatever, is that playing a major role in UCLA's ceiling right now?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different factors. So from that angle, from the booster and fan angle, UCLA has billion-dollar donors, obviously. They just donate to build buildings on campus, build the academic buildings. But they're not that interested in athletics for the most part. What you have is Casey Wasserman, who's, he's worth a couple $100 million. But you've got people at a lot of these schools that are in college towns who have billionaire boosters who, oh yeah, I'm all in on Kansas athletics or Oklahoma State athletics. And so you've got a little bit of that element. You've got a lot of these guys. Yes, they are more invested in Lakers. They're more invested in the Kings or the Rams or whatever. And so you've got a lot of that. But I would say that from a recruiting angle with attracting kids to come to UCLA, I think it's 50-50 whether they're really interested in being in a big city where they can do all this different stuff, or they really like this game day atmosphere in Tennessee or whatever it is, where it's like, oh yeah, there's 100,000 people at every single game. And so it kind of just depends on the kid. I would say the biggest factors that actually limit UCLA is probably the Rose Bowl. Being 25 miles from campus, I think that's a big deal. I think it does limit the creation of future boosters when you've got students who, they've got to make a trek to get to games. There's Reuter buses, but as you know, Dan, hanging out in LA on a Saturday afternoon and trying to get to the Rose Bowl is not anyone's idea of a good time.
No.
So there's a lot of factors in play that probably limit UCLA, and there's stuff to overcome, but these aren't insurmountable obstacles. I mean, being in LA, being in this market, and having access, you probably can't build a national title contender just from Southern California. Even USC can't, but you can produce really good teams and then sprinkle in some national recruiting when you're really good, and you can do it. But there's lots of obstacles to overcome, even at UCLA.
All of this stuff is like very smart. It's also on the macro level, but back to the defense for a second. You mentioned Dan Lynn for a hot minute. We joke on this show all the time about half teams that have really good offenses, really bad defenses, or vice versa, right? Iowa.
You joke about the Pac-12, you mean?
Yeah, some of the Pac-12, but we joke about Iowa. I mean, it's
we're fair.
It's about as fair as we can be here. I have been trying to understand from published reports what Danton Lynn is going to do differently on defense. Now, he in and of himself is a pretty big departure from what Chip has done typically as defensive coordinator, right? This is a 33-year-old guy, no previous experience as a coordinator, but very much seen as a rising star. I can't ask you in mid-May how he's going to fix the defense, but I can't ask you what he's going to do differently than his predecessors that might produce a different result. The best that I've been able to find is that he prefers versatility, and the description I saw sounded a lot like Total Football and Ted Lasso. So I'm hoping maybe you can clarify where things are going with Danton Lynn.
So as you know, Chip Kelly is not super forthcoming about, certain things about the program, basically everything. But Dan Lynn, I was able to talk to him a couple of times. I don't think it's going to be a huge departure formationally. I think they're still going to run mostly a 4-2-5, but that's pretty much all of college football these days. You're running some form of either a 3-3-5 or a 4-2-5 nickel. Almost all the time. What I noticed this spring was they're probably a little bit more aggressive with their nickels than they were last year. Last year, it was a lot more trying to play coverage. Nickels were spending a lot of time in the backfield. And now it's hard to gauge. Some of that is spring. Some of that is just, they know the offensive play call, so they can just get there really quickly. But there was a sense that even the deep safeties were getting upfield super quickly. Now, whether that actually turns out a good defense is anyone's guess. It looks a little bit more aggressive. Now, that being said, the personnel hasn't really changed much. They added a lot of guys on the offensive end. J. Michael Sturdivant at wide receiver is going to be a stud, but on defense, it's more or less the same guys. I mean, Darius Muasau is still going to be the middle linebacker. He was the transfer in from Hawaii last year. The defensive line is going to be more or less the same. The Murphy twins who transferred in last year are going to be two of the guys in the rotation, defensive end, Leatu Latu is the best player on the defense. He's going to be the other side. So it is going to be very dependent on the scheme improving because player development will only take care of so much. But if the scheme improves, I mean, how many times have we all watched in college football, new coach inherits same guys and suddenly they look a lot better. You mentioned Anthony Barr and Eric Kendricks earlier. That was what happened when Lou Spanos and Jim Mora came in. They suddenly looked like a good defense. So D'Anton Lynn, he's saying the right stuff. He's saying, we're going to be multiple. I don't want to design a scheme before I see the guys in spring. He saw the guys in spring. Looks like they're going to run much the same thing because that's what they were familiar with. And a lot of it's going to come down to play calls. And frankly, he hasn't called plays before. So we don't really have a great indication yet what it's going to look like.
I almost, and I'm putting words in your mouth, I almost hear, the defense should improve. But also, new quarterback, whoever that is, new starting quarterback, new receivers, new running back that will be leaned on. Are you worried about the offense in as much as one can be worried about the offense with Chip Kelly, that they're winning games because of the offense these past couple of years, and now they might be winning games because of defensive experience and being able to scratch out points when need be on offense, but it's not necessarily a strength because of all that is new?
Yeah, so looking at the offense, I would say the main question mark for me is probably, weirdly, quarterback, not weirdly. Looking at the receiver core, J. Michael Sturdivant looks, anybody can catch 65 balls in that Cal offense last year. Probably pretty good.
He's definitely good. Definitely good.
Definitely good. He's a stud. Combination of size and speed UCLA hasn't had, I don't know. When Jordan Lasley had his head screwed on straight, and then before that, J.J. Stokes, it's otherworldly. But that's also a reflection of what UCLA's had at wide receiver. And then Kyle Ford, the transfer in from USC, he's going to be really good. I think he's finally healthy. He had such a tough time with injuries at USC. So those two guys added to a group that includes Cam Brown, redshirt freshman Braden Peak, and they're going to be really good at receiver. It's going to be a question of who's delivering the ball. Right now, Ethan Garbers, who is the holdover, he looks like the likely starter at this point just because he was the most consistent in the spring. But 17-year-old Dante Moore, who knows how much progress he's going to make over the summer.
Right.
He was doing stuff this spring, and it's like, wow, his feel for the game is beyond, any freshman you could ever expect. But there's some stuff where, he's not a huge cannon-armed guy, and he's trying to do like wrist flicks and just kind of toss the ball. And on intermediate throws, you cannot do that. Just safeties, even UCLA safeties, crashing down on that ball really quickly. So there's still some stuff he has to pick up about the speed of the game and like literally the speed of the players he's throwing against. But there's a ton of upside there because his feel is truly incredible. And then offensive line, they're going to work something out. They've got a couple of transfers coming in. Colorado's Jake Wiley, Old Dominion left tackle Kadir Kunta, along with some holdovers. They should be able to put that together. I'd say the offense should be fine. I think it's going to be top 20-ish.
Okay.
TJ Harden coming in at running back will also be pretty good and taking over for Zach Charbonnet. But they should be fine. I think the question is, can the defense get to top 60? If the defense can get to top 60, it can make up for, dropping from a top 5 to a top 20 offense.
Do people within the program, when looking forward to joining the Big Ten officially and playing a Big Ten schedule, is there concern? This is you build a program based on who you're going to play somewhat, right? Mm-hmm. That, you're going to focus on this type of offensive lineman, this type of defensive lineman, this type of quarterback. It's all for your internal vision of the program, but also like you build based on, your schedule. Do you see anything changing? Do you see a recruiting strategy change? Do you see a build, an ideal build in a recruit changing? How is this going to go 2, 3, 4 years down the line?
That's a great question. So as of yet, I think the main thing is that they have started to recruit a little bit more regionally for that area. I wouldn't say the recruit type has changed, but they've started to look more at guys in that area. I mean, Dante Moore.
Sure.
I don't know if they would have necessarily targeted him, and not because they didn't want him, but because they wouldn't have thought they could get him. But I think part of the attraction, it was probably lower down the list, but part of the attraction of going to UCLA was the fact that, well, I'm from Michigan, so this will be okay. I think there's other guys that they're targeting, especially offensive line. I think that's the way they're probably going to approach it, is we can target a lot of those Midwestern offensive linemen in a way that we weren't able to before.
Right.
I think that's what Chip Kelly's kind of thinking. And then I don't know from a system standpoint how much they will change. I think for a lot of those Big Ten schools, I think USC and UCLA coming in with, particularly USC, coming in with that sort of offensive style will be a big shift for some of those schools.
Sure.
They have enough trouble dealing with Ohio State and the mild variations on offense that they do. It's going to be really interesting to see how, say, Michigan and Jim Harbaugh approaches handling USC in particular, but even UCLA with its multiple kind of varied pro-style offense.
David, I'll get you out of here on this. The UCLA schedule this year seems like it's set up for 10 wins.
Mm-hmm.
They're at both Utah and USC, but no Oregon, no Washington. The non-conference slate seems extremely workable. However, new quarterback, new running, like a lot of new that we just discussed here over the last few minutes. Vegas right now has them at an over-under of 8.5. We have not done our over-under show yet. We won't for a couple weeks. Just wondering, upon hearing that number, how you feel about 8.5.
It's a good number. That's what I would say. I think 9 would probably be my guess, because just looking at it, San Diego State on the road, I think if this was 3 years ago, Chip Kelly, I'd be like, I don't know about that one. Mm-hmm. But as it is, the talent in the program is enough that I think they should be able to handle that. Coastal at home is obviously better than Coastal on the road, and then NC Central's FCS. I would say, I would put it at 9-3, but I would probably avoid that number. I would say if you can get it at, I don't know if you're going to get it any lower than that. But yeah, I think 9 wins. I think 9-3 is probably what I'm thinking going into the summer.
You can find him on Twitter, David Woods. He's the co-host of the BROcast for Bruin Report Online, as well as the Podcast of Champions, a year-round Pac-12 podcast. David, thanks so much for coming on here and sharing some of your wisdom.
Yeah, thanks, fellas. Enjoyed it.
All right, there you go, Dan. David Woods. Check him out, BruinReportOnline.com.
Yeah.
I didn't prep you for that question, that joint question.
No, that's okay.
But I thought it would be appropriate because there is some overlap between what Chip's done at UCLA, what he did at Oregon. And
sure.
I'm always curious for guys who have been around if they're trying to build the program in the same way that they did at one or more of their previous stops.
You could kidnap me in the dead of night and throw me into a van and say, give me all of your thoughts about Boseko Lakambo or TJ Ward or Ifo Ekpre Olomu in the Chip Kelly era Oregon, his time in Eugene. And I would have thoughts. I'd be able to weigh in with enthusiasm and hopefully a little bit of insight. So that is the least of your. I'd be like, Dan, tell me about cupping pepperonis. Like, well, how much time do you have? A lot of it has to do with the casing. So no, David's fantastic. You should listen to his Podcast of Champions, all about West Coast football, Pac-12. Can I ask you a question?
Oh,
just as
absolutely.
We overlap between our 8-win sessions and now begin our 10-win quest sessions.
Yeah.
What do you think is the most difficult leap to make between embarrassingly bad to bowl eligible, bowl eligible to legitimately a threat to that 8-win threshold, from legitimate threat to really good 10-win threshold, and then really good to elite to be one of the best, 5 to 7 teams with a shot at making the playoff and winning a playoff game. National championship's a little bit of a different story, but in that general tier, where do you think, if you're wearing like the old school advertising in Inside Sports magazine in 1993, what were those strength shoes maybe?
Yeah.
Where's the most pronounced vertical, the most difficult vertical leap to make?
I think we're talking about it now.
8 to 10?
I think 8 to 10 is really hard to do.
Yeah.
Because there is a level of consistency that you need to get to, both on the field and off the field with respect to recruiting, now with respect to NIL. I mean, it's a more complex universe. It's just really hard. I was looking at Pitt earlier. I'll come back to that.
Mm-hmm.
Pitt has been a very stable team. And I know they've left a lot of meat on the bone, a lot to be desired. If you're a Pitt fan, I read all of the criticism of Pat Narduzzi and his offenses and blah, 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 his recruiting operation, you name it. But they've been really stable. They've been a really good program.
Mm-hmm.
They've been like an 8-win program. Getting to 10, though, is really freaking hard. Getting to 10 for them, again, a very stable program in a very winnable conference. It took Kenny Pickett. It took a generational quarterback for that program.
A Bolitnikoff receiver, yeah.
A Bolitnikoff receiver and Jordan Addison before he left to get to that next level. So I just think it's really hard. And it's probably easier if you're a team like Notre Dame to get back to that level. You've got more football history. Not to say Pitt doesn't have that history. They've got a rich history in and of themselves. But they're starting from a different place and it makes it hard. It's not quite the destination as some of these other blue blood programs. And so it's just really friggin' hard to do.
Mm-hmm.
And you talk about Oklahoma State. We're going to talk about some teams on our next episode, much in the same way we're talking about Pitt and Oklahoma State and UCLA on this one, where everyone's in the same boat. There's just it's not even a thing that they're outright missing. Maybe UCLA is missing defense, but it's just incremental improvements, marginal improvements on this side of the ball in this position group that can make a team get to that next level. And it's hard to do.
I think I agree with you. I think once you're at that 10-ish win program to get to elite, it's certainly damn near impossible. But the unique jump between 8 and 10 is usually like, your Mario speed running through a schedule, but then you got to still avoid, the gap or the spinning fire, whatever. Like there is that element to, you can't lose to Georgia Tech. You can't lose to Arizona, UCLA. You just can't. I know you're allowed a down week, but what do we say? You got to win your clunkers. You got to pull that game out 35-34, not lose it 34-28 kind of thing. And so to do that generally requires it's a great culture, it's a great roster, and it's having a roster in which every single position group has good players. And so I think you can get to 8 with star power here and there, and this position group is strong, that position group is strong. Maybe you try to cover up for a weaker secondary or a weaker, group of receivers, but you can get to 8 with just certain strengths. To get to 10 means week-to-week focus, having good dudes all over the field, NFL caliber talent all over the field.
Having some kind of silver bullet.
Totally. Right?
Having a few gravitational players that you can build around. And again, I'll use the Pitt example. I think Pitt's a really good example.
Mm-hmm.
They've had some of those guys more than often on defense.
Yeah.
Their defense has been pretty well figured out. Offensively, it happens. They've got their running game kind of figured out, but there are aspects of the offense that have gone missing. And it's just really, you can't invent those guys.
Yeah.
You can't just make them out of whole cloth. You either got to get them in the portal and get lucky, or you have to convince them out of high school that they want to come to your school. And it's just really hard to do that when you've got so much competition, especially in the corridor where Pitt is.
Yep.
It's hard, really hard.
It's smashing through the windows that are open. And it's with Oklahoma State last year, whatever the case, you're starting over on defense, or not starting over, but it's a new defensive coordinator, but you return your quarterback and you don't pull out the TCU game. You have that window to beat an excellent team. You don't do it. You pull out Oklahoma State, I believe, beat Texas last year. You can fact check me on that, but I believe they showed a capability to come back and beat teams or hold on to leads, and then they have the opportunity against a down team and it floats by them. And so I think UCLA exclusively lost to teams with bad defenses last year. Oregon, Arizona, and USC Pitt obviously in the bowl game, but within the Pac-12. And so it's when you have that fifth-year starting quarterback, as Spencer Sanders, DTR, whoever, when things are aligned, Pitt got it done, right? With Kenny Pickett. Forget the Western Michigan game. They actually won 11 games, right? So they were able to take advantage of, and there are always going to be weird cycles within your conference, but they did it. And so that to me is the difference. It's just when you see those opportunities to actually take advantage. UCLA could still have beaten USC even with the turnovers and couldn't find a way. And so that to me that's the big difference, is then you start talking about the margins, and it's a fascinating jump.
The margin thing that's what makes it hard.
Yeah.
And I think that's where you drive yourself crazy trying to figure out where you can improve, where you can make marginal improvements. It's not, we're talking of it more broadly in terms of the third best offense, 89th best defense.
Yeah.
But if you unpack either of those position groups, it's a lot more complicated. Maybe it's the linebacking core, the receiving core, the blocking up front. It's just really hard to figure out where you can make up some ground. And to further answer the question, I do think the jumps are different depending on the conference you're in. If you're Pitt, the jump to get to 10 is easier than if you're, say, Mississippi State trying to get to 10.
Totally.
In the SEC, it's a weird sport. It's just where we're at.
Yeah.
We appreciate David's time. We appreciate your time. Thank you for downloading, for listening, for supporting the show. Verballers.com is where you can go if you want to help support what we're doing. That is our Patreon. We've got much coming up on the Patreon side. The aforementioned baseball show will finally happen. We're excited about the off-topic, non-college football show that we're going to do here very, very shortly. We also do bonus content of a different variety in the form of our Brew and A episode.
Yes.
Dan, we have a Discord that is teeming with folks doing watch-alongs, talking about all things college football and beyond here in the off season. Again, mid-May, not much to talk about on the college football side, so we talk about other things. It's a good community of folks, again, at verballers.com. Check out quickslants at solidverbal.com. That is our newsletter. We send it out every Thursday, bring you up to speed on what you might have missed in the world of college football news. And last but certainly not least, make sure you hit follow or subscribe on your podcasting app of choice. If you are ever so inclined, a rating, a review, that stuff does help. We promise you, we'd appreciate it greatly. Only if you say nice things, though.
Of course.
Only if you say nice things should you take the time.
And even if you have to reach, even if you have to be like, hey, I got good microphones, we'll take it.
Yeah.
We'll take it.
I will take that.
Yeah.
I will take that. Anything else from you, Mr. Rubenstein?
No, that's it.
For that guy over there, my good friend Dan Rubenstein. For our guest of honor, David Woods, my name is Ty Hildenbrand. Thanks for downloading, listening, and as always, supporting the show. We will talk to you all on Thursday. In the meantime, stay solid.
Peace.